Welcome. Welcome everyone to this COP26 Panda Hub event. This event, as you know, is called How Can Courageous Companies and Financial Institutions Lead in the fight against climate change? We chose the word courageous very, very much on purpose. Why do we think this is important, and why do we think we need courageous companies and financial institutions? As you know from the synthesis report of the UNFCCC, we are in a pathway of 2.7 degrees. With the announcement that have been made around this, there's still some debate that would take us between 2.1 and 2.4 degrees in trajectory. We need the action agenda, the agenda that is working with the real economy to lead on this fight. And also to lead by making exemplary commitments and action. And this is what we're gonna hear today. What we have put in what we call our blueprint for corporate ambition on climate and nature that you can find on the web is a very, very clear mitigation hierarchy that is based on the SBTi just published net zero standard. But not only that, we have to have companies that can abide by the standard, but do more. Do more in meeting that gap, helping us to meet that gap, and helping us to push towards the regenerative economy that we need to see. So today, financial institutions are making their way in showing how that ambition gap can be met in a systemic way. And that's very important. And also leading companies that have a big influence throughout their supply chains can help us to do so. So we're gonna have this panel moderated by Margaret Kulo here to my right. She's the lead of our global finance practice for WWF International. She will present our speakers, but before I turn over to Margaret, we're gonna see a powerful clip of a very, very interesting project that the finance practice and our UK office and other offices around the network have been engaged with. So I leave you with the video and I leave you with Margaret.
Our economic system is underpinned by the services of nature and the stability and resilience it provides. But flaws in the finance system have helped tarnish our natural world.
The impact of climate change and nature loss becomes increasingly difficult to predict into the future and even more complex to ensure.
What's the point of receiving a pension when our children cannot even play outside?
Revolutions happen when the majority of people think that it's a mistake to try and block change.
In the terminology, it would be a climate Minsky moment. And that's what we need to avoid, which is why we need to start moving today.
Do we invest money in the practices that take us deeper into this crisis, or in the solutions that could get us out of it?
Our finance sector has unwittingly bankrolled the destruction of the very natural systems it relies upon.
Since the Paris Accord was signed in 2015, banks globally have continued to invest $1.9 trillion into the fossil fuel industry, and that's despite knowing where that's leading and what the consequences are.
The financial system is not doing a great job of distinguishing between good and bad growth.
Putting ourselves on a trajectory to devastate the natural world and our way of life forever. But our future doesn't have to be this way. Our finance system needs systemic change.
The financial sector is an enormously powerful and effective force and can be a force for good.
No sector is better placed to drive the transition to a sustainable economy than the finance sector itself.
The public needs you to take the lead. and needs you to be brave.
We need to build a finance system which is recalibrated to the long term. One that is transparent, so all investors can see what their money is funding. And one that takes climate, nature, and social development into account in all financial decisions.
The finance sector plays a crucial role in the fight against climate change, but it cannot do it alone. We need a coordinated response across many sectors: government, energy, technology, the legislative and regulatory environment, bringing all these together to make a meaningful impact.
The thing that gives me hope is that people are rethinking how capitalism should be structured at the top table. It's huge. And if they're successful, then we will live in a much more sustainable future. If they do not succeed, then the economies will collapse and civilization itself is at risk.
As we navigate our way through the biggest economic crisis since the Second World War, the existential threats from climate change and nature loss are still looming. Now is the moment to reframe our idea of value and build a new system. One that will safeguard ourselves from future global shocks. If we do this, we'll be leaving a legacy of which we can feel justly proud.
Thank you all for joining us. And thank you to those of you who are joining us online as well. This is a really great film. If you have an opportunity to see the full Our Planet series, it's on Netflix. We launched it about 2 years ago. And then we started work with companies and with financial institutions to do these engagement films. We call them as follow-up films. So we did one focused on the business community and the business sector and how changes can be made in the supply chains, as Vanessa mentioned. Thank you very much, Vanessa, and good luck on the rest of your day today. And this is a short clip from the film that we recently released on finance. And one of the things that really strikes me about this film and the work that we've done in gathering these voices is, whereas 5 years ago, you really only heard environmental organizations talking about climate, talking about nature loss, and you had development agencies and you had philanthropy in the conversation. We are in a completely different place today than we were 5 years ago, maybe in some sense even 2 years ago. And we'll talk a little bit about today the big launch of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is only 2 years old now, a little bit over 2 years old now, and the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero that now sits around that seed of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, in the finance sector pushing for the real economy to decarbonize. That leadership that we're seeing. We'll also hear from a leading corporate on how a corporate can think about impact throughout the supply chain and not only reduce negative impacts, but start to have a positive impact across the supply chain. I'm really happy here to be joined by some great voices, some people I very much look up to in this space, leadership for years. And I want to start by introducing Fiona Reynolds, who's the CEO for the Principles for Responsible Investment. She was also named by Barron's Magazine as one of the 20 most influential people in sustainability globally, and you've been an inspiration to many people, including me, all around the world. Thank you very much for your leadership. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Gunther Tollinger, Dr. Gunther Tollinger, who is the Group CIO on the Board of Management of Allianz. And he's also the chair of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and also a leader in this space, really taking the decision to join this effort when there wasn't a clear path on how you get it done. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the conversation. And Andreas Ahrens, Joining us from IKEA, the Inter-IKEA Group, he's the head of climate in the sustainability work that IKEA leads. So we get to hear what leadership looks like from a corporate with an extensive supply chain. And hopefully we'll get into a little bit on deforestation too, and the linkages across for all of you, not just climate net zero, but the linkages to nature, for example, through climate, or through deforestation. So I want to start with an easy question. What does credible net zero look like? So we're hearing a lot about these net zero commitments by financial institutions, by companies. How do we understand what that means in a real way to make impact in the world? Fiona, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks. So, well, in terms of the finance sector, you mentioned GFANZ, and which is the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And we now have 130 trillion in assets under management US that has actually signed on for to be part of GFANZ. And there's a number of different initiatives that are part of that the PRI, who I work for, is part of, which includes the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which Gunter will talk about more, the Net Zero Investment Managers Alliance. But it's easy for, of course, people to make pledges about things. It's easy for governments, it's easy for corporates, it's easy for investors as well. But I think, one of the important things to have serious net zero, a net zero pathway is that you really need to have an action plan that's based on science. So I think that's, really the most important thing. That it's one thing to have a 2050 target, but you must also have interim targets. We can't wake up in 2049 and get started. We need to have interim targets. For the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance that Gunter will talk about some more, for example, there's 2025 targets, and investors have just started putting out their targets, which is fantastic. And we've tried to balance that with the Paris Agreement. There's the ratchet every 5 years. So we've tried to also have with the Asset Owner Alliance that you have to keep increasing what you're doing. And then I think it's really important that those commitments are transparent, that you report against them, that you're clear about where you are, and that you really limit offsets too. I think that's important. I think it's also important to point out, though, that decarbonising the economy isn't easy. This has not been done before. So this is a huge work, and one of the other things that's really important is that we do it in a collaborative and collective way, because there is no one financial institution that is going to be able to decarbonise the economy. There's no one company and there's no one government. And we're all learning as we go along, and we all need to come together to do that. And that's why some of the collaborative groups are really important. And so I've been at the PRI, we've been trying to get investors. The PRI was launched in 2006. And at that stage, we came out of the UN system. It was very much about how did you bring sustainability to capital markets? And we've been plugging away at these issues for years and years and years. And now I think finally sustainability in terms of finance is becoming mainstream. But it hasn't happened overnight. It's taken a long time to get there. But one of the things out of all my time of working at the PRI that I am absolutely the most proud of being involved in is the Asset Owner Alliance. And as I said, Gunter will talk about it more, so I won't say everything. But Gunter did come into my office in London a number of years ago and said, I've got this idea and we need to get more investors involved, and do you think we could get something off the ground? And it took us a while, but we did get there, and now we've got really leading asset owners around the world making the strongest commitments to net zero. But I'll let Gunter continue the story.
Please continue the story. So why don't you talk a little bit about how the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance was formed, and I will share my favorite quote from you when the early discussions were happening. Don't be nervous. There was I remember you saying, I have beneficiaries who won't retire until 2060. And there's no investable universe at 4 degrees of warming with which I can provide them earnings in 2060 when they retire. I don't know how we're going to get there, but now we have no choice. And it was really, if I think about the word courageous and moving forward, that's really an example of stepping forward and making this commitment in the absence of a clear path even to get there. How did that feel from your perspective in the founding? And then maybe if you could eventually get to sort of how you work it through the institution, because it's one thing if you have an idea, but then how you get that through your institution to really get them to buy in.
Yeah, thank you. I would say in terms of feeling, well, it was actually not so difficult because there were quite some strong partners. There was, of course, let's say the UN convening it, let's say PRI really moving it. We have, let's say the partners, let's say the Wildlife Fund, obviously, but also Global Optimism, who all gave lots of energy, let's say, to this effort. So to have the question in the first place was perhaps already doing the trick, because then all of a sudden, let's say, many of these people who are very big experts came together, driving it. If I may come back to your, let's say, first question about the credibility, I would say the credibility is very difficult for now, absolutely. So everybody can make a commitment. The question is, or not so much a question, in something like 3 years' time, 5 years' time, the question about credibility will be super easy to answer, because it's just have people delivered against the, let's say, the targets, or if they don't have, then perhaps was not so credible. Or so in 5 years' time, the thing will be easy in terms of credibility. And this is why I believe it's so important to have fairly short-term targets, because if targets are fairly far out, one could come to the conclusion that these targets are not so credible, obviously. Or this so this is one thing that we should really be talking about. And then there is another element in terms of credibility. Are these institutions really changing themselves? So is, in addition to certain targets, a certain form of the decision-making coming as a change? Is there, let's say, the compensation system for decision makers taking in capital impact, climate impact? Is this happening? And if this is happening, then credibility, I would say, is fairly high, because all of a sudden, financial KPIs and climate, and perhaps ideally even sustainability, are at the same level. And that makes clear that the decision-making really has enhanced. Very much so.
And did you, in your organization, did you change bonus structures, for example, or any financial incentives to try to bring people along? Did you need to do that?
Yeah, this is exactly what happened. This is, and you can read this. Many of the organizations of the Asset Owner Alliance, they have changed their compensation system. So this is one thing, but there's another element. And sorry if I talk too much about these things, but there is a very important question: who is really representing in these efforts? So is it the senior leadership, or is it kind of delegated to, and I very much admire these people, let's say, to the sustainability experts. So is the sustainability expert team representing the organization, or is it really those people who do the, let's say, overall decision making? And that overall decision making, as I say, needs to be enhanced, and that follows if it is really the very senior people who all of a sudden say, yeah, it's absolutely clear, climate impact is a part of my decision making, is part of my compensation, and if I'm not going to meet targets, then my compensation is simply lower.
Yeah. And what does that look like in the corporate space? So you have at IKEA set a leadership agenda on climate positive, net zero. And how do you think about how you put the incentives in place? Where are the decisions made? How do you push down the targets in order to make sure that you're delivering?
And I think that it all comes back to your first point. What makes a credible net zero commitment? And to come back, I would say it's 3 things. I would say, first of all, it needs to be encompassing and transparent. So, I mean, all of us companies, I think we need to take full responsibility for our entire business, our entire value chain. And I think we also need to be transparent. do we include all greenhouse gas emissions? We saw the methane pledge. I mean, methane is a greenhouse gas part of the Kyoto Protocol, should be part since long ago. How do we include land use change, both positive and negative? Is it part, or is it being excluded? And that also has an impact on nature. So if we take that as a basis of encompassing and transparency, of course we also need to report on an annual basis. Second part, I would say, it's setting targets in line with science. We know that we need to have absolute greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 without any removals or storage emissions. And then by 2050, at latest, we need to have reduced it by 90%. So we have 5 to 10% residual. Then, I would say, then is how we do removals and storage for that remaining piece. And from our side in IKEA, we will do it within the value chain. Of course, investments in resilience is of course important, but we companies need to do and address the root causes as well. So to compensate that final part, you need to do it within your value chain. That's our part. Then thirdly, so far it's all about transparency and ambition, but we as a company have a responsibility, I would say not for the external part, but what we're on to the internal stakeholders, our company. How do we turn these goals into concrete roadmaps? What are the main actions to be taken within each and every department, securing that they have a specific goal and a specific portfolio of movements and actions, so we can identify, is it solutions we have in place? Do we need to have innovation? Do we need to have investments? So we have that, and that makes it very, you can anchor it very, very well in the organization as well, because it's not just a fluffy target, it becomes concrete. And of course, if you want, you can also share that externally as well to show how far on the journey towards net zero are you, both the historical emission reductions, but also what is the forecast going forward. I think that is a very credible starting point.
And so you make it sound easy.
Oh, it's not. But I mean, we're not here because it's easy, right? We are here because we're trying to make the impossible possible by working together and sharing experience. So I wouldn't say we are there yet, but I think it's key to identify what needs to be done. And then when you do that, you identify what can you do yourself and what do you need all of other people and stakeholders around you to commonly do this together.
And what's hard?
Many things. But it depends. I would say it's so easy to say it's only one or two things which are hard. I mean, just looking at IKEA, at ourselves, what we want to do, I mean, we know almost 50% of our footprint comes from materials. A lot of it is wood. That's good from our part. We're a huge actor. But when it comes to steel, we're maybe not that big of an actor. So how do you drive an active agenda towards recycled steel or fossil-free steel, for instance? Those are really difficult things to address. I wouldn't say we should get stuck on how deep down the supply chain it is, because it's just about how you set up your business model. But of course, we also have access to renewable energy as well, and also what are the policies and regulations today which encourage you to actually make this shift towards 100% renewable energy. And we still see that's an uneven balance, I would say, between subsidies for fossil industry and enabling renewable energy as well. So it's on many levels.
Yeah, I want to get back to the fossil fuel subsidies in a bit. Fiona, coming to you on the question of courage, I think it was 2 years ago, you can correct me if this is wrong, about 2 years ago, for the first time, PRI delisted PRI members. And there were a couple of things about that was interesting. One, how long it took, but if you look at some of the initiatives that came shortly after that, almost immediately upon their being announced, there were calls to kick people back out because they hadn't met the timeline yet. So it was really striking the way the field has just moved in the time. When you started PRI, I won't answer the whole question for you. When you started PRI, you were really just starting, bringing people on the journey, and presumably the priority was on, getting them to join the journey. But talk about that, making that decision to delist.
Yeah, well, it has been a long journey, and we're still on in terms of getting people to commit. And so we're always conscious of balancing the two things, that you want people to be able to get started and to learn from others, but at the same time you don't want to allow greenwashing. So that was why the decision was made that there was enough, that people, there was enough information out there, there was enough best practice, there were enough things for you to be able to get started, and there was no really excuse anymore for you to say that I couldn't do this. Early on, you could say, you know, but hang on a minute, how do we do all of this? We're all still learning, and part of what the PRI and other organisations have done is tried to build the practices and the guidance and the tools, because how do you do this without the tools? But I would say one of the things that is really quite amazing now when you think about finance, when I started working in this space, it was very much that the role of a corporation was to make money, full stop. The role of an investor and its fiduciary duty, in how fiduciary duty was really interpreted from many investors, was my job is to make money for my beneficiaries or for my clients, full stop. That was it. And so it's taken a huge mind shift, and in some cases regulators to really come out and confirm to investors that, you know, when they think about making money, they have to think about risk, and they have to think about environmental, social and governance risks. But also, it's never made any sense to me at all. I've never understood how this can be the case. And when I think about it, even now, and I listen to some investors who still say this, you just think, how does anyone think that it's okay to make money at any cost while in the pursuit of either exploiting people or exploiting the planet? And that we know that we can make money, we know that we can make profit, but we don't need to exploit people or exploit the planet. And you know, this is a game where we need better regulation and better work from government. But I do think that I can't underestimate how much a shift in mindset it has gone on. And to listen to people today in the finance sector talk about these is, to me, you know, feels like a miracle, and thank God it's happened.
There was a great quote in the film, if you watch the whole film. The woman who leads a fintech company, we saw a quick clip from her. She says, "We're not here actually to make money, we're here to make value." And it's very interestingly delivered. And to Hiro's point also about what's the point of having a pension if your kids can't go out and play? So to you've had a lot of conversations in particular with pension funds in the context of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And what's always struck me about that group of investors is the time horizon. And it really does drive a fundamentally different sort of thinking, because you're looking at 2060, you're looking at 2070. What kinds of issues have come up in that conversation that you have with the pension funds as you're trying to bring them along in the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to meet targets, to set short-term targets that are credible, to deliver in the absence of, you know, everybody wants the tools to be able to do it, and we're still in the process of developing those.
Yeah, I would say one is indeed, as you just mentioned, indeed the long-term horizon is quite obvious. So this is one thing, and then of course the thinking in this long-term horizon, how is actually investment management going to look like, depending on how is actually our economy, and then at a later stage, the discussion also went clearly, as Fiona said, very much towards how is actually the entire planet going to look like. I do believe, also emphasizing what Fiona just explained, we are clearly on a track to start to understand that an economy needs to live between something like a social minimum and an ecological maximum. We have clearly to deliver globally a social minimum to everybody on this planet. While at the same time, we absolutely cannot break, as it is called, the ecological ceiling. We just can't. Now our economy is clearly not delivering on the social minimum as we want to have it, while at the same time breaking the ecological ceiling in all forms. And that is something that now starts to really become mainstream for certain investors. It does, especially for long-term investors. This is the case because they do understand whom they are actually catering to, who are the clients, and who will be the clients. And therefore that understanding now, let's say, starts to come in, and with this, then obviously the discussion comes in, how does an economy look like that lives in, let's say, in this space, social minimum and ecological maximum, and what changes actually need to, let's say, take place to get us there ever more.
Now I want to turn to you, Andreas, and talk about not just climate, but nature, explicitly. So IKEA, as you mentioned, is a major user of forestry products. How do you think about your footprint? How do you think about maybe not just lessening your footprint, but improving, leaving things better? Talk through your whole climate positive approach and your impact on nature in particular.
Sure thing. Maybe I should explain what our take on climate positive is first before we go in there. So our approach is that we will reduce more greenhouse gas emissions than the IKEA value chain emits while growing the IKEA business. So we're a business, so we want to make the profit. And the key thing, we will do this without carbon offsets. And this is where people usually gets their attention. But for us, I mean, going back to how we look into our climate footprint, of course, before we start investing in nature, I think we need to stop harming it as well. So I think there needs to be a commitment to end deforestation within your value chain, both directly and indirectly as well. But of course, then how to make it better than that. So as to say, we have 1% of all commercial wood is going to IKEA products. And today we have close to 100% FSC certified and recycled. We're now on a journey. How do we take the next step in that movement? Because, of course, we can be satisfied with that, but we can't. There's so much more to be done, both how we increase the rate of recycled wood, how do we improve management practices, but also, I mean, how can we invest in projects outside of our value chain for reforestation and regeneration as well? Not using it as an offset for our footprint, but rather that it's our responsibility as well. We have a huge impact here as well. So there we set aside at least 100 million euros to actually invest in projects, both internally and externally, in our value chain as well.
So how do you know? How are you certain? How do you do the tracing through your supply chain on the question of deforestation? And how do you explain it to an investor like Gunther? So if Allianz wants to make a no deforestation commitment, how do they apply that across their portfolio and know that the companies that they're invested in have some credible way of determining whether or not there's deforestation in their supply chain?
I would say when it comes to wood, I mean, we rely on the chain of custody and the traceability of, say, FSC certification schemes and so on, so that those needs to be credible and strong. Then in general, I think there are elements maybe of indirect deforestation, where today it's maybe issues of traceability and how can we actually work together to get traceability. For instance, soy, that's one aspect. And then it's how to work together within our value chain, but also with other partners to actually secure that it's deforestation free. So that is really important. And I think that overall we need to use responsible sourcing schemes as a way for this vehicle, but also how we improve management practice in it. And then finally, how we tell investors that's the benefit of IKEA. We're a privately owned company, so we don't. But we do have a sustainability report, which we release every year to tell people about our journey.
So Gunther, you say you want to make a no deforestation commitment. How do you think about finding that in your portfolio? Do you think that you have the tools today, do investors have the tools today to actually be able to know whether or not the companies they're investing in are deforestation free? And what would you need to have in order to make that determination?
Yeah, bluntly speaking, no. We don't have the tools yet if it comes to deforestation. We really have to do, let's say, lots of work in terms of information gathering and quality assurance processes. And we should be very honest about this. This should lead, hopefully very soon, to a form of a standard of information provision that is comparable to what we know currently from financial reporting. This is where we should get. The impact in terms of, let's say, climate or nature overall needs to, let's say, be made transparent. And I would dare to say it should be made transparent not only for investors or, let's say, owners, financing partners, but also for consumers. Both actually needs to be ensured. And this is why we work so much on this policy request of a standardized reporting. Yes, admittedly, we are now really talking about standardized reporting for climate impact. This is the topic. Deforestation goes in that direction. Deforestation, however, may actually have much, let's say, a broader context, as we all know, especially if we think about biodiversity. And in that reason, or in that context, I would say the whole discussion about standardized reporting needs to broaden at a certain point in time. For the time being, it is really the climate impact only that we talk. Yeah? The next steps need to follow.
Yeah. And so we've been making the case, and many other organizations together with us, that to your point that this needs to be in the financial reporting, these are no longer non-financial matters. So the sustainability issues frequently get reported as sort of non-financial reporting. But some of these issues are clearly financial risks. And we are getting ever more information, ever more ability to run the numbers, if you will, to demonstrate that financial risk. At what point do you get to put that on your financial reporting and not have someone say, no, actually, we still need to put that in the sustainability non-financial reporting? How do you, from your perspective, how do those things get married up?
Yeah, I would say we not necessarily need to combine this with financial reporting. It's okay if it is. It's no problem. What I would argue is we need to reach let's say, an assurance level, as we know it for financial reporting, for sustainability reporting. This is what we need to work towards too. And whether this is then combined in a financial reporting or whether there's a financial reporting and sustainability reporting, well, I don't know. As long as the quality is assured. We, however, are, for the time being, fairly far away from this in terms of the data provision, the processes there, let's say the auditing being set up. There are clearly initiatives. Open source climate is, for instance, one. Let's say ESAP, the single access point is something on the government side in Europe. And of course, I mean, this morning we all have heard about, let's say, ISSB, in what direction this is going. So this is clearly on its way, but there's quite some work to be done. I'm more describing already a target picture, and maybe for some very far in the future, I hope we are not.
Yeah, we're all excited about the accountants saving the world. It was very big. If you didn't see it, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a joint effort of SASB and the IFRS. So we're now going to get the accountants on the agenda, and it's very exciting news. Really, always good to have accountants. Fiona, talk a little bit more now. So we did climate, we did nature. You mentioned the social issues, and at PRI a number of years ago, you started this big effort to really get after trade in people. And it was an amazing discussion to see a bunch of investors asking, how can I make sure that there's nothing that I'm doing to facilitate this illicit trade of human beings across borders? And it was a tremendous example of leadership. Tell us about how you did that. How did the conversation go when you started? Was it hard to bring the PRI members along? At the end of the journey, they all appeared to be there with you.
Yeah, it has been a difficult issue, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But we do spend investors do spend a lot of time talking about climate issues, and I don't think that social issues have risen up the agenda enough, and they need to rise up the agenda further. But as it stands today, there's more than 40 million people in the world in some form of modern slavery or human trafficking. So to put this in context, it's 1 in 185 people. 77% of those people are women or girls. A huge number are children. It's a $250 billion annual business that, you know, lots of traffickers don't want to end. They want it that, you know, they want that money. It's easy money for them in many ways. And it comes back to that, how can we use our money by exploiting other people and by turning a blind eye to these things. And from an investor's point of view, it's about really understanding your supply chain. And it's about having discussion, the corporations that you're invested in. And it's not enough just to understand. So in the early stages of these discussions, it was, oh, well, you know, as a company, I'm not responsible for what happens outside of the company. So, you know, I outsource, and then there's more outsourcing, and then there's more outsourcing. And of course that makes it incredibly difficult, but you're the one who's outsourcing and you still have a responsibility. And I do think a lot more work has now happened around that traceability down the supply chain, but there's still a huge amount of exploitation of people. We all know about child labour. We all know about all of these issues that happen, particularly in developing countries. But it's not only in developing countries. Modern slavery and human trafficking happens right under our noses as well in developed countries. But then just when it comes to climate, the other thing is that, you know, climate is obviously not just a issue to do with the planet. We also have to think about the people who are impacted. And from the investment community side, we've tried to do a lot of work and doing more on it around the just transition, so that we understand that we are transitioning out of fossil fuels, but it's not just about thinking about this issue from an emissions reduction point of view, as important as that is, that we need to discuss with companies. We also know that people are being left behind and communities can be left behind. And how do we make sure that they are part of the discussion that we're having with companies and with governments about what do we do? Can there be an investment in those communities? What happens with those workers? Because we see the consequences if we don't think about that. If we look, I'm not trying to be political, although I am political, but if we look about what happened in the United States, for example, why did we see, a move to things like the Trump administration, and this has happened in other countries? Because everyday working people felt left behind and alienated, and a lot of that is going to continue to happen if we don't provide solutions. And why should working people be the people who pay the ultimate price for climate change? That they're not. When we can find solutions can retire people early, look at new jobs, look at new investment, it just needs thought and planning.
So how many investors, just give a percentage, are now having this kind of conversation where they're thinking all across the SDG wheel, right? From climate to nature to poverty and all of the human elements. Have we reached a tipping point? Is it just, 10%? Is it 1%? How soon can we get to at least half? Give your perspective on where we're moving.
Look, on the climate side, I would now say that the vast majority of investors are considering climate. They may be at different stages of where they're at and different stages of leadership, but the vast majority are. I don't know how you'd attract capital really if you weren't able to show today that you had a plan. If I was an asset owner putting my money with an investment manager and they can't show me about what they do on climate and how they integrate it and what specialists that they've got and how they think about it, well, I wouldn't be giving them my money. So I think it's actually become a business imperative. I don't think social issues are at the same level, and that really needs to change. I don't know why we are valuing the planet more than people. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be looking after the planet, but we've got to look after people at about the same rate.
Well, to your point, they're not disconnected, right? Because you can't. The reason we have a 1.5 degree target, yes, it's science-based, but that's really people-based. That's the temperature in which we have an Earth that is suitable for us to live. The Earth will be fine at 4 degrees. We won't be there to see it, but the Earth will be fine. So you can't actually separate these issues.
I think, that's why I like the word sustainability, because in the early days of responsible investment, we used the words ESG, so environmental, social and governance. But what then tended to happen if people put them in buckets? So I'm thinking about risk from an environmental perspective or a social perspective or a governance perspective, instead of thinking about them in a holistic way. And they are, of course, interdependent. And we know from the pandemic that you cannot have a healthy economy if you don't have healthy people and a healthy planet. And we all rely on each other. So I'm hoping if there's anything good that can come out of the disaster of the pandemic, hopefully it is people understanding those interdependencies.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think just coming back to my first point, that net zero commitment needs to be encompassing or say holistic. This is exactly it. I mean, why we're trying to limit climate change, it's its effect on people and biodiversity and nature. So I feel sometimes it becomes a bit strange when we talk about climate and nature, where, I mean, the people and nature is the foundation of why we are trying to limit climate change. So I think that's also key. If you want to have a credible climate agenda, you need to make sure that you're not sawing off the branch you're sitting on. So, I mean, if you want to address things, you need to take that in considering everything you do. Otherwise, you're kind of missing the point of why we're even doing it from the start.
Yeah, and I was reminded yesterday that whereas when the Paris Agreement was signed, we were talking about warming between 4 and 6 degrees. And now we're looking at, NDC's at 2.7 or so, could be better. And we're credibly talking about 1.5. So we have made some progress in the last 5 years and some progress in connecting all of these issues. I think in particular the pandemic, it forced us all to sit back and say, what have we done? And how is this, as someone said yesterday, nature always pays you back. And that works in both directions, right? You don't treat it very well and then you feel that back. And then if you do treat it well, you also feel that back. So it's important to remember, nature pays you back. I want to move to a question of what we want to see out of the COP and what do you think you need to actually get your agendas done from the policymakers? Both in general, what sort of policy environment will help you, Gunter, deliver a net zero portfolio, 1.5, meeting all the targets all along the way? What's the supportive policy environment look like? Let's start with that question.
Yeah, okay, they are I would say the standard type of policy requests. We mentioned already one, which is the standardized reporting company and product level. Really important product, not only company. Product also, because it must be investors and it must be consumers. But that is one. The other one is, of course, let's say the discussion around carbon pricing, market-based, global. And with that comes, of course, subsidies, because subsidies are obviously, let's say, the worst form of non-pricing. That are well known, and subsidies is super well known. Kyoto, I think, was, let's say, a COP where it was agreed to actually get rid of those. So this is a little bit into the policy request area, but in terms of, let's say, what could come out of COP is that we recognize that this is a COP where the private sector is perhaps very well represented, perhaps more represented than ever. I'm not a COP veteran, but due to Fiona's efforts, I had the chance to be at 3 of those, and I was told it is really this time private sector is really well represented. So it seems private sector and let's say governments, multilaterals are really coming together, at least in a conference. That's good. What now needs to really happen out of this is that we take this momentum to get to very concrete plans country by country. Why is it country by country? Because governments are country, while The private sector is global, international, and whatever you want to have. Country by country, very concrete plans. Just as an example, such a concrete plan would quantify what is the energy volume and mix 2030, roughly at least. And then it would talk, how do we really provide that energy? And out of that, we would derive what needs to change now to provide it as defined in that plan. This is what we need to do. We need to bring together what governments need anyways to do for their NDCs, to enhance the NDCs, we have more ambitious NDCs, with the project by project, company by company logic of the private sector. So we get really to an aggregate, country by country. And that will then really help us to work together on this transformation. Now sometimes people say, no wait, we do have these plans, and I dare to say no. There are some countries who have a very special, let's say, governmental system where there are 5-year plans, but many other countries don't have such a thing. And you see this, for instance, in Europe. You just need to look into something like the gas market, to just go a little bit into my let's say, home territory. The gas market clearly tells you there is no long-term plan, because this is why the gas prices are developing as they are developing. One could even come to the conclusion, we do not even have a plan for the next winter. But that's perhaps a little bit too extreme. And I'm really talking about very long-term plans, as I mentioned. They will define how the transformation is going to look like. This will bring together the private sector and governments, multilaterals, as they are here represented at COP. And then we get the momentum going.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Andres, what do you need from the, what does supportive policy look like to help you deliver what you need to deliver?
Yeah, I would build a lot what you already said, Günther, but I would say basing it amidst ambition. I mean, we need to see as many NDCs as possible, moving to being 1.5 compliant and being concrete. Exactly what's wrong to country by country. What will happen? I mean, who will phase out coal by when, etc., etc. That needs to be concrete. How do we push zero emission fuels, etc., etc. But then that gives us some kind of also what does it mean concretely. Then it also means what are the framework of the rules we're playing by as well. So what policies, regulations enable the movements as well. So how can we see investments in infrastructure or policies which maybe enable purchase of renewable electricity and so on, which will enable us as a company to make the right movements forward. But as well as also policies which can limit the needed movements as well, such as subsidies for fossil fuels. They need to be phased out as well, but of course in a just way. So it's easy for many. So I think that's concretely, to be very short and precise.
Fiona, same question to you, but then add, because you've talked a lot about the way companies use their lobbying budget and the way companies use their policy, their political engagement, voice, and dollar. So combine the questions. What do we need to see from policymakers, and how do we get investors to proactively get their voice there?
Well, I think it's sort of covered in terms of from these two about, you know, what do we need? We need the governments to have plans, and we do need the phase-out dates so that investors can invest with some certainty, and they will deploy capital if governments are clear about the expectations. So, you know, a phase-out date for fossil fuels. When are we going to have? What's our clean energy date? When are we going to have, what date's phasing out for the combustion engine? When are we going, what about building standards, so that, you know, buildings, there's new building standards that are in place that we can retrofit old buildings. All of those sorts of plans of what we need. I really think, though, that I'm quite convinced that the private sector is ahead of governments now. In many cases, that's not to say there aren't some good governments out there, but I think in general the private sector is actually leading the way, and we need governments to catch up and provide us with the roadmaps and the certainty that we need. And then, what was the last part of your question?
To the lobbying question, how you use your voice.
Yes. Now, this is one thing that they could do. Ban corporate lobbying. Make it illegal, or at the very least, make it have to be disclosed in your, you know, everywhere, in your accounts, etc. How much money are you spending on lobbying? It's an issue that doesn't get enough attention. We wouldn't be where we are today with climate if it wasn't for the anti-climate lobbyists in both the financial sector and within the corporate sector. And, you know, politicians who have taken their money, we would be much further along. And obviously it doesn't just happen in climate, it happens in, you know, a lot of other areas.
And how do you engage positively? You know, how do you get the members of PRI, for example, to use their voice to engage for positive policy change?
Yes, so more and more of our signatories do that now. When, you know, in the early days, they were very reluctant to engage with governments, and they saw that were they lobbying governments. But I think there is a difference when you were trying to bring about positive change and work with governments than trying to lobby against. And I mean, we just have to look still around the world at all the things that are happening, and the lobbyists are, you know, still playing a very dangerous game. I always say up to this point in time, they're the ones who have won, not us. But I do think that the you know, the tide's just starting to turn, and that we're starting to win the day and not them.
So my last question, as we start to wrap up, what do you hope to get out of the COP? What would success look like from the COP, from your perspective? Andres, you want to go first?
Can I hand it over to Gunter just to give me a minute to think?
Do you all want
welcome.
A minute to think?
Well, I think I mentioned it already. On the policy requests, we really hope, let's say, that people move. I mentioned the three already. And in terms of the momentum, the success of COP is not necessarily only defined by COP itself. It is defined by what we are going to do, let's say, right thereafter. What initiatives do we really start? How do we actually work together once we have met here, let's say, at the COP? And therefore, we have a big chance to make COP really, really a very big success. We could make the mistake to simply, let's say, right after end of next week, draw conclusions. This perhaps wouldn't be, let's say, so helpful, but if we understand that many, many things are started here right now, we could actually start to believe that this can be one of the big successes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Are you ready yet?
Yes, now it's okay. Thank you. No, there are, of course, many outcomes, but I mean, to keep it also, to summarize the whole COP as well, I think also respecting the mechanisms of the whole Paris Agreement as well, the ratchet mechanism, and how we push as many NDCs as possible in line with 1.5. That is a key outcome that should happen as well. So as countries now update NDCs, and then to make it once again as concrete as possible. So we also know what is coming concretely for us as business, so we can plan what is needed and what will be done in each country. Then of course it's also not just from us as a business, but overall, and just to finalize the whole rule book as well. Article 6, and now we'll also close the gap for financing. Basics, pretty much, according to what was agreed in Paris 2015.
Fiona.
Well, I think many of things have been said. I think out of this COP, I want world leaders to understand that they can't come to the next COP without actually having commitments and NDCs in place that are actually going to get us to 1.5 degrees. And I would like to see that any world leader, any company leader, any finance leader who is not doing that should not be allowed in the door, and they should be kept on the outside and the protesters can, you know, deal with them.
You need to make the commitment before you can get the credential to come to the meeting. That's very good. I want to thank my panelists very, very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Andres Ahrens from IKEA, Gunter Thallinger from Allianz, Fiona Reynolds from PRI. It's really been a pleasure to spend the last hour with you. Really appreciate the conversation, and I hope also, Gunter, to your point, that the conversations don't end here at the COP. This is yet another step along the journey, a journey that we need to bring more people along to get to 1.5. Thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.